There's something happening here, but what it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there, telling me I got to beware. I think it's time we stop, children, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. There's battle lines being drawn. Nobody's right if everybody's wrong. Young people speaking their minds are getting so much resistance from behind. Every time we stop, hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. What a field day for the heat. 1,000 people in the street, singing songs and carrying signs, mostly say hooray for our side. It's time we stop, hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. Strikes deep into your life, it will creep. It starts when you're always afraid. Step out of line, the man come and take you away. We better stop, hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. We better stop, hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going. We better stop now, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going. We better stop, children, what's that sound?
Noyina. Noy. Yi. Na. Noyina.
In 1914, at the outbreak of World War I, the Melbourne waterfront was a very different place. Warehouses, cold stores, fresh food markets, customs buildings and ferry stations spilled out into the streets and laneways of Melbourne's south and west.
First time down here, I think it would have looked like chaos. There would seem to be traffic jams everywhere. There would be people coming and going and talking about things in an argot that you wouldn't really understand, and the discussion would be about, you know, the price of wool at the wool exchange and the difficulty of getting a ship in and out. So this is a really thriving part of the city. The Port of Melbourne was the main port of Australia. The waterfront's really this sort of very modern, functional network of new ports, railway connections, buses coming down to the port, railway viaducts, big modern functional hotels with elevators. And you would actually probably come across, I think, a much more multicultural environment than nowadays we give it credit for. You would have crews who'd be picked up in Colombo. So you'd have, Sri Lankan and Indian crews coming in and off the ships. You would have some crews from the Pacific who'd be a mixed European, Polynesian crew coming off the boats. You'd hear people speaking with American accents. You'd hear the whole cacophony of accents from the British Isles. Some of the shipping lines, at least up until the start of the war, were German-owned. Some of the ships coming in were Swedish-owned, Dutch shipping lines. So in lots of ways, quite an exciting landscape.
Seafaring life was strange and hard. Journeys were dangerous, difficult, and exploitative. It was the sort of work where you could be swept over the deck and into the waves.
In Europe, obviously the distances travelled were less, but if you were going to Australia or New Zealand once they were colonised, that was a long way to go, because that would be 100 days, whereas now it's about 27, 28 days. So you were at sea for 100 days. I mean, a lot of ships didn't have wardrooms or, as they have now, they didn't have a lot of space. You might be in a hammock still, or be in a cabin with 3, 4, or 5 others.
Seafarers started life young as child apprentices who could spend their entire working lives as ship's crew. Sailors were ashore for weeks at a time while waiting for their ship to unload, reload and provision. Like today's fly-in, fly-out workers of remote mining towns, they were cashed up but isolated.
So you get into Melbourne or Sydney, into the colony, and you've got some money in your pocket because you may be paid off. What are you going to do? Well, you might go to the closest pub, or someone might entice you to go into lodgings, and then suddenly you can be taken away and put on another ship, and suddenly you're back at sea. So there were issues in relation to that, and that again is why Bethel came out to Australia and New Zealand and set up the missions.
fearing for the spiritual well-being of seafarers and inspired by early flying angel missions in England, the church decided to set up a floating chapel in Hobson's Bay.
So it gave you a place that once you'd been at sea for a long time, that you could come on shore and sit, read, write, or have a little bit of space for yourself.
The missionary work expanded rapidly, and at the outbreak of World War I, shore-based mission buildings had been built at Port Melbourne, Williamstown, and on the Yarra River.
It didn't matter what your denomination was, whether you were a Catholic or a Protestant or agnostic or whatever. It was somewhere you could go where you were safe. I mean, it started off as the Bethel Institute in the 1850s, and then it became part of the missions to seafarers in 1907 when the Reverend Goldsmith came over.
The charismatic chaplain, Gurney Goldsmith, firmly believed women should be more involved. To this end, he called upon Ethel Godfrey, a well-connected member of Melbourne's high society. Miss Godfrey was a formidable force. Together, they created a group they called the Ladies' Harbour Lights Guild.
The ladies were a who's who of Melbourne. They were proficient fundraisers. Women had always been involved in the mission in some way. But this particular group were experienced. They set up a structure which recruited not only local members, but also members around the state. Miss Godfrey, so many strings to her bow, if you like. Because of her position as daughter of a settler and landholder, she was very well connected. Her entertainment skills meant that she was quite in demand in Melbourne society. Entertaining seafarers was also very much a key part of the mission. It was about making use of idle hands, if you like, to occupy a group of people who might be otherwise loose on the streets and getting into trouble. The organisation only lasted into the 1960s. They sort of got lost in history, but they were absolutely fundamental to the operation of this mission, and not only this mission, but missions around the world.
Admiral Bunshir, the fleet's commander, hopes to fall upon a British squadron, destroy it, and slip back into his base.
War intensifies the difficulties and danger for seafarers, including for the young apprentices.
The orders are secret. Only the commanders know their target is the Dardanelles.
Life at sea became far more perilous, and suddenly people were dying across the seas in unprecedented numbers.
Suddenly a periscope is sighted. Torpedo boat destroyers go into action. Deck guns begin firing.
Some sailors left the merchant marine and joined the navy to fight. Others worked on ships requisitioned to transport troops and
And
supplies.
the enemy disappears.
Well, the Royal Navy has armaments and actually looks after the security of the country. The Merchant Navy are the seafarers who are actually carrying cargo. So they're the commercial side of shipping. And they are the ones who are more at risk really in terms of war, because they can't fight back or it's fairly limited.
Shipping to Australia was much reduced during the war years, and this placed pressure on those whose livelihood depended on transport. But the work of the mission went on.
There were still many regular visiting ships and crews that were caught up in the World War I conflict, and quite a few of them as regular visitors to Melbourne were known to the Ladies' Harbour Lights Guild.
War had a fairly immediate impact. You had the organisation of women's groups, for instance, into doing a lot of charity work, and that really starts to become quite extensive. And then moves into a period of a lot of fundraising for the war that is done in a very visible ways, often through women's groups that are local groups.
The mission's ongoing work was complicated by the unfortunate instruction from Melbourne Port's bureaucracy that the just-built mission building needed to be demolished to make way for port facilities. Undeterred, the women of the Harbour Lights raised the funds to help build not just a new building, but an architectural marvel.
So the architect would have tried to understand the need, tried to understand what he needed to bring to the lives of the people who were going to use the space, to the lives of the community who would use the space. And then clearly there was this overarching spiritual kind of association. How can I give them somewhere that's spiritual, that gives them a place to remove themselves from the street outside?
The main building and the chapel were completed before the end of World War I, despite the labour shortage and the need to compete with fundraising for the war effort.
How can I give them a home in a city that's possibly not their home? Those sorts of narratives are wound into the architectural solution here.
The chapel was dedicated to the memory of the merchant marine who lost their lives in the conflict that would become known as the Great War.
A seafarer has been away from home, and they know that when they come to Melbourne, that building is going to be there. And I think that is very, very important. They still have exactly the same needs as what they had 50, 100 years ago, and that's why we're still here.
The mission to seafarers in the 21st century is an outreach service effectively. It cares for spiritual and practical needs of sailors who are visiting the Port of Melbourne.
And we bring them in from the ports on the bus and we get them to sign in the sign-in register. We offer foreign currency exchange.
The client group was the same. in 1857 as it was in 1906, and it is today.
The building, in a sense, becomes a memorial to the work of the women.
This is our secret garden. It's noisy today because of the construction. When you've been at sea for many, many months, it's a great opportunity to put your feet on the soil.
It's a gem of a building, really. It's hard to think of other buildings that were built for working class people.
After you, into the chapel.
So the story that it's here for is actually related directly to the story of the people that it was catering for.
There's work to be done on it, but there's always work to be done on it. But it is something which is certain, and seafarers like certainty.